Hello and welcome back to the Cortright cast episode. I honestly am unsure about what episode
22.
we're on. I think it's actually 23 now. You know, last week's episode, I announced 21, I think, and it was 22.
Oh, that's why I thought this one was 22.
Yeah,
I don't keep up.
I got super, it might have been 22 and 23. I don't know. I got super out of it on it. So I'm done announcing the episode. We've passed the, that opening when you're starting a podcast, you're like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you get to like 800 and you're like, it's another episode.
Just start saying, here comes another one.
I'm already here. Yeah, here comes another one. So welcome back to the podcast. Today we are talking about the career of Christopher Nolan, the acclaimed director. And we're going to drill down on a bit of an interesting topic because Jonathan has an opinion here that I'm not so sure that I agree with, but I think you could convince me. And that is that Dunkirk is Christopher Nolan's greatest film.
Mm-hmm. His magnum opus.
His magnum opus, Dunkirk. Yeah. Now, see, the thing is, I could be swayed.
Okay.
I could be swayed, but I need you to sway me because it is my opinion that I think that if I were to point to a magnum opus type of film, I would probably lean more towards Inception.
Okay.
That being said, it's been years since I've seen Inception. And like I said, I can be swayed because I feel like there are a lot of variables at play. And when I saw Inception, when you see it at a time in your life and you really love a film and then it becomes a memory for you. Mm-hmm. And, I've really enjoyed everything that Christopher Nolan has done over the years. And the thing is, when we saw Dunkirk in theaters, when it came out, I enjoyed the movie. I thought it was a very, very good movie. However, I didn't walk away thinking that was Christopher Nolan's greatest film or that was one of my favorite films.
I actually did walk away from it thinking that was like instantly probably his best movie. Mm-hmm. Like I was really like floored by it, and the experience of seeing it in theaters has, like you said, become a memory that like is great. It was a really great experience. But so my opening argument for why it's the best, I think that it is right in line with Memento as the best one, but I think Dunkirk wins out a little bit. I think Dunkirk is his tightest movie. I think it's his most stripped down in a lot of ways. I think he really shed all of the stuff that he isn't great at. All the stuff that he's just sort of dragged along in a lot of his films.
What would you think the things he isn't great at are?
Characters, emotion. Really characters and emotion. I never remember the names of his characters in movies. He never seems that interested in them.
I don't think of that as
using them as like players to move forward an idea.
Yeah, see, I don't think of them as characters that require or he's wanting them to be major emotionally driven characters. But I cut it the slack in that area. It makes
moments like it makes stuff like DiCaprio's character in Inception. It falls entirely on DiCaprio to sell that character because while the ideas behind the character and the sort of very, very complex emotions that Nolan wants to fit into the complex ideas in the movie don't necessarily come through with the character. And it's all on the actor. He relies heavily on incredible actors to carry these characters. And most of the time they do, and it's fairly successful.
I was going to say Inception.
That's a good movie too.
In Inception, I thought that was the case. I actually think that might be why it's one of my favorite films of his, because it has all the other things. It has all the great set pieces, the mind-bending plot that he's done in other movies, but I feel like he really nailed in Inception the most. And that's one of the things that I do love. I love when he leans more into the theoretical science fiction type of directions for his films. But I thought that what pulled it all together for Inception was that it had such a strong team cast.
Yeah, and I don't think that it was done poorly, but I think what helps with Dunkirk is that he was able to shed the stuff that he wasn't as strong at and focus on what he was strong at, which was making very like visceral. While Dunkirk is a much simpler movie than a lot of his other movies, he still works in a very complex time element that clicks at the end. And I think he was able to strip it down to the elements that he's really, really great at, the stuff that he's best at, which is that, you think the beginning of Dunkirk, like the opening shot is incredible, and it just instantly grabs you, and you're along for the ride right away. And it's got this great score that's very similar to all of his previous scores, where he has this, like, I forget what it's called, but it's some like musical technique where it sounds like it's increasing in tempo, but it stays the same. It's just the same chugga 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 thing. And it's like he took that element that's in basically all of his movies. He took the very, like, visceral filmmaking that he brings to the very high concept films and stripped it down to a war movie where you never see the threat, you never see the enemies once, and made it thrilling and tight and just incredibly well paced. It was like everything about Dunkirk clicked together in the right way to be his best film to me.
Yeah, and see, for me, I really loved the experience of Dunkirk. Upon watching it, I could not deny what a visceral, thrilling experience it was, from the opening shot to the end, to the score, to the cinematography. And even I thought that it's probably one of his films with the more understated acting performances across the board, even though it still had a stellar all-star cast. But I thought that he pulled off everything well. But in the end, and this is a problem that can come across in multiple of his movies, and maybe this is an opinion thing, but in the end, I think the lack of a connecting storyline or character arc at all kind of pulls me away from it, in that I can look back on it and go, that was a great film, but I don't look back on it and go, I adored that film. Like I can look at it and go, that was just fantastic. It looked great. It sounded great. It felt great. But then when I look back at something like Inception, I get a feeling. I really remember the aura that these characters brought, and I also understand that, like, a movie like Inception has a little shinier set pieces too, which are very lovable. But even, going back to, and I know you have somewhat disparaging opinions of, like, Interstellar, and I understand the criticism of that film. However, I think that might be his best film for character development and character portrayal. And once again, you could say that he relies on Matthew McConaughey for that, but I thought Matthew McConaughey's performance in that film was, in fact, that is one of the few films that Christopher Nolan has ever put out where I have been emotionally gripped. I'm usually gripped in a way of, like, I'm thrilled, excited. I want to understand the plot, understand what's happening. And while Interstellar has a little bit of that, I didn't find, like, I wasn't wondering, like, what's going to happen, where's the plot going. I was following Matthew McConaughey's character and sympathizing with him. And I think that's a strong point that he really nailed in that movie. And you could put it on McConaughey or on Nolan. That's neither here nor there. But I think that the fact that is missing from Dunkirk, even though you're saying, the fact that he doesn't do it is him leaning into his strengths, because in his other films it has been, and I would argue that the whole him not being great on character and emotion is not something that bothers me. Tenet is a great example.
Well, it's not that he's not great at it. I think it seems like he doesn't care.
Yeah.
It seems like it's something that he's not interested in, but it's something that comes with writing a science fiction film or writing a high concept, But it's like sticking with a gimmick for Dunkirk. Whereas Dunkirk, there was clearly no attempt there, because that wasn't the type of movie that he was trying to make. He was basically making a survival movie. And in conveying that, I think he did it perfectly, because he never made it feel like, oh, I wish I knew more about these characters. Yeah. Like, you're supposed to feel like the characters. You're supposed to feel trapped. I would argue that I feel like that about, say, a movie like Tenet, because that's been one of the criticisms that I see of Tenet is, obviously, like, you don't even really know the name of the main character. You don't know who's who, what's what. It's confusing. But I get the feeling that is that's intentional. And I personally, from a writer perspective of just looking at the story and how it unfolds, I really appreciate it. And I think he pulls it off really well. Which, that being said, when you're comparing Nolan films, there's really there's not a lot of gaps between them, I would say. I think you could easily point to The Dark Knight Rises and Interstellar as some of the weaker films, but even across the board, they're still very competently made for the most part. I think also Dunkirk was like a sort of like, to me, a triumphant return for Nolan, because he did Dark Knight Rises and Interstellar back to back. And both of those movies had very similar problems for me, and I didn't enjoy either of them. So it was like a restoring of your faith. It was like, oh yes, he can still do this. This is great. But yeah, I think Nolan is really, like, exceptionally good at certain things, He's exceptionally good at set pieces. He's incredibly good at like that. I don't even think it's his high concept ideas that are the impressive part. I think it's the way he plays with time. That's really what sets them apart.
Or pacing, like, I think, goes in hand with that.
Yeah.
Like conveying time and pacing.
But like Memento, it's like, oh, the high concept part of it is like, you know, it's a guy who basically has short-term memory loss, or he can't create new memories. So, you know, he has to like tattoo his body to remember things while he's hunting his wife's killer. It's like, that's the high concept part of it. But what's really so impressive about that movie is that it's a movie that plays in reverse. It literally plays end to beginning. And writing a story where the beginning of the movie is the climax of the movie and making that a satisfying payoff is really what's impressive about Memento. And in a similar way, I think Dunkirk, sometimes his ideas can get so big that if you look too hard at them, they don't make any sense. I think that is a problem with Inception. Inception, I'll excuse it because it's such a fun premise and such a well executed premise. But if you look too hard at it, it really doesn't make hardly any sense. And there's numerous plot holes, but the movie works well enough that you can excuse that. Dunkirk doesn't have that issue because what he doesn't have
he's not trying to do something he can't pull off.
Right. What he does is he pulls off something. He sort of sticks on a certain level and just goes, I'm going to do this the best like that I possibly can.
Biting off more than you can chew.
Right. But he sticks the time element. He still puts this like complex structure.
It's still a Nolan film.
Yeah. That has a satisfying click at the end. And that's what was so impressive about Dunkirk to me. Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting because you would consider Memento to be his second best film. And it's interesting because that was his second film that he did.
Yeah.
This was before anyone really knew.
It was his first like funded movie. His first one he funded all himself.
Following, wasn't it, that he did first?
Yeah.
He did that all himself?
He did that all himself. I think it was shot on a budget of like $6,000.
Jeez. I haven't seen that one.
Yeah. It's like super, super low, super low budget.
But yeah, so Memento, it was the first film that he did, and it was shortly after that. He did one more after that.
He did Insomnia with Al Pacino.
For some reason, I mix up like those two names, like Memento and Insomnia. They almost like feel like the same thing. I don't know why I see that, but then he went straight into Batman though, right?
And he did Batman, and then he did Prestige, and then he did Dark Knight. He alternated. He did Batman, Prestige, Dark Knight, Inception, Dark Knight Rises, Interstellar. And
when you're considering, when you're looking at his career, do you almost like kind of? It's interesting because when Batman was coming out, that was kind of his claim to fame. But I feel like he's transcended Batman really well. Like moved on and still, he didn't get stuck in I made a superhero
while
movie.
He was making those movies, he was alternating his own movies.
And they were doing incredibly well. And
Inception was, about as much of a success as Batman was. And he made it like, it's very clearly a Nolan movie. Like everybody knows, he's a very household name. Like everybody knows Inception is a very Christopher Nolan movie. Interstellar is a very Christopher Nolan movie. Yeah. Not just because so many of his movies start with the letters IN, but
I actually not even noticed that.
But he made himself a very recognizable name. And he has a very recognizable brand.
Yeah.
I feel like Dunkirk
is really
impressive
though to do.
Yeah. I feel like Dunkirk is a little off brand for him. I feel like in many ways, even though it's a lot simpler than his other movies, it seemed also his most challenging in a lot of ways.
It's less in your face in terms of like being a Nolan film. Because like you see a movie like Tenet and you just go like, of course that's what Christopher Nolan decided to make. Dunkirk, right. You go, oh really?
Yeah,
really? That's what we're doing.
It was a really interesting choice, especially after Interstellar.
Yeah.
To basically go, all right, I'm going to scale everything back. And and he basically doesn't provide the hook that those movies do. But I think in scaling back and scaling down, he was able to just execute a movie to the like highest degree. Whereas, Inception can be applauded for what it went for and what it achieved. I feel like Dunkirk didn't fail to achieve any of the things that it tried to do.
Yeah. And that's something that I harp on all the time, especially in writing, is like, if if you have an idea of a 17 point POV story that's like overarching across 6 galaxies, that might sound really cool in your head, but if you don't pull it off, no one cares. Right. But if you can pull off one singular story that's 140 pages about one person on one day, that's going to be way better. And I feel like that's exactly, you know, on a different scale what Nolan did, going from, and it's hard to say because I think he does pull off the high concept stuff, but when you get so deep into high concept things, I actually cut him a lot of slack when there are things that could be questionable or maybe don't make as much sense, because it just kind of blows my mind that anyone could even come close to pulling off a big budget movie like that to begin with. So I tend to be like, well, it was fine. I liked the movie. Right. And that might be a flaw of my own, as well as I do fall victim to the allure of like high concept films in general, just because I really do love like the science fiction, especially the philosophical, theoretical ideas that movies would explore like that. And I want Nolan to keep doing them because no one's getting the budget that he does for films like that in Hollywood, which it's really, I feel like it's a niche that if not for Nolan, we wouldn't really have. Yeah. Like we would not get movies. You couldn't get an Inception budget film that looks as good as it does with an all-star cast without the beef behind his name.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. I just think it. I think I love what he does really well, and I've always felt like the higher concept he got, while it sometimes is very impressive and sometimes is less impressive. I always feel like he started small. Memento is a very small movie. Insomnia was a very small movie. I feel like the bigger and bigger he got, the more certain flaws showed through. And as somebody who loves his smaller movies, I felt like Dunkirk, while it certainly isn't as high concept as something like Inception, it still was on a small scale. Mm-hmm. And it's still like, it's not like, oh, Inception was such a hard movie. Dunkirk, that was probably so easy. Like it very much wasn't.
Yeah.
And I felt like him being able to pull that off. I mean, even just the idea of having a war movie where you're on the edge of your seat constantly and you never once see who they're scared of.
It's like all the gimmicks. It's like, and I wouldn't say that he's a director that's reliant on gimmicks, but you could see a lot of his films as having one hook, like gimmick, and all the ones in Dunkirk are still there. If you look at it, you're like, oh, this is so Christopher Nolan. Right. But you also, if you don't really look at it and pay attention to what's going on, or I haven't seen it, you're just watching the trailer, you're like, that doesn't look like something he would do.
It's much subtler. Yeah. While still including all the things that you like about him.
I mean, it still has the 3-scene intercutting, the time, the and it has the building ramping up pace, the soundtrack. Yeah, like it literally.
It's some of the best 3-scene intercutting because you're cutting on 3 different time planes. Like that's what's that structure. I remember when I saw it in theaters, like I didn't actually get how the timeline lined up, but once you realize like where they're cutting to and how they're intercutting and the way that it lines up in the end, it's like, oh wow, that's perfect. Yeah. How you craft a story that's like in 3 different places in time and have them all climax in a, you know, what is probably a headache to edit, and make it that thrilling and also pay off that well.
Oh yeah, because I mean, even just in any type of story writing, whether it be for a book or a film, like that's one of the biggest headaches in general is the more characters or plot lines you have, you have to tie them up in a way that they come one after the other, and trying to finagle those pieces into the puzzle can be, it's just such a headache. So any director, and that's why, I mean, and so many films do this, you know, that's like one of the tent poles of any story. You have to be able to do that, but to do it on the scale that he does is so well and so satisfyingly is more impressive than I think like a casual viewer would even think to notice.
Yeah. I also think Dunkirk has some of his most like iconic imagery. I think it's his best shot movie. And all his movies are really well shot.
Yeah, they are.
But there are several like
something about Dunkirk really stands out.
Like the image of like the burning plane and Tom Hardy when he's like caught at the end.
Yeah.
And the bit where like, you know, the main character is like trying desperately not to get hit by these bombs that are dropping, and you just see it like go boom, 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 and climb like closer to him. Like stuff like that is just so impressive. And also You know, he does this with all his movies, but he tries, like, if he can do it in camera, it's going to be done in camera.
Yeah.
And Dunkirk is so authentic looking because it is scaled back to the level where, like, everything, you know, pretty much everything was real as much as you could. And so those shots on the beach are just, like, even more impressive knowing, like, that was real.
I would say it's his most beautiful movie visually.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't even mean just because you could point at some of the other ones and be like, they look crazier, but in terms of just, because Interstellar had a lot of really great visuals too. But if you look at Dunkirk, something about it, it feels like an art piece, the film in general. Like, the film feels like art, not a story, if that makes sense.
Like, when the main character, like, first gets to the beach, like right at the beginning of the movie, and it's just this wide shot of, like, the beach. You really feel the space.
Yeah.
You feel like those hundreds of thousands of people trapped on this beach.
Yeah. The whole movie is so feeling based in general.
Yeah.
I mean, the entire point of the movie is to make you feel things. It's not, they're not really telling you a story. You're not really getting lots of information. You're not following a trail of breadcrumbs of information to understand a mystery, you know?
Yeah.
And that being said, you know, talking about mystery, I would love to see a bit of a return to not necessarily just the roots, you know, the Memento roots, but I like how Dunkirk pulled everything back a little bit. But I think one of his best places to be is in that prestige mode, where I think he handles plot really well. And instead of leaning into like technology and high concept like theories, I really like how the prestige plays with information, you know, and the kind of mystery thriller type of thing there, and playing in a different time period where you're not working in science fiction, I guess. I really like that. And same thing for like Memento, like, I think playing with concepts that are confusing to wrap your brain around, but still grounded in reality is a place where he thrives. Even
probably his most underrated movie, not because it's one of his best, but just because I feel like very few people have seen it, is Insomnia, which is a very, like, scaled down, very small, very straightforward compared to almost all of his other movies, crime thriller. And it's one of his earliest movies, and it's probably one of his worst ones, but it's still totally worth watching. But it shows, like, after seeing all these, like, very big, very high concept blockbusters, it shows that he can execute just a very straightforward movie to a very high degree. And I would like to, especially after Tenet, see him maybe return to the like you said, the mystery thriller roots, and do something smaller, or
it doesn't even have to be smaller in that, like, I would love to see him take the budget he has now to a movie like The Prestige, you know, to take the allure, the cast.
But I think doing something more, maybe less focused on set pieces and more focused on, because Dunkirk is a very set piece focused movie.
Yeah.
And Tenet is a very set piece focused movie. I mean, the whole high concept of that isn't really, I mean, it is played within the plot, but it's largely played with in the set pieces.
Yeah.
So I think almost scaling down to a less set piece heavy movie and a more plot based movie would be an interesting sort of return for him.
Now, where do you think, you know, in the grand scheme of Christopher Nolan films, I feel like it's gotten easy, especially when you're looking at the, you know, film critic type of side of things. It's easy to look at the most recent films and such. Where do you think that things like, I wouldn't say the Batman trilogy fall, but, you know, a movie like The Dark Knight, like, a lot of people, that's one of their favorite films of all time. You know, that's an iconic film of its era. You know, like, where do you think that falls, I guess, in his legacy? Because when it was happening, that was like, oh, this is Christopher Nolan, the guy who's doing Batman so good. No. And now it's like, we kind of not forget that he did Batman, but we kind of, that trilogy got its place in time and kind of just got left. Yeah. Everyone remembers it, everyone respects it, but we kind of just, like, left it behind.
Well, it's also sometimes rare for a director to move on from a big blockbuster like that and go on to do successful things after. I don't know. It's different for him because he was making his own movies while making those movies.
Yeah.
So it's like, it wasn't like he stopped to do Batman and then came back to his own stuff. It was like he was still always releasing his own stuff.
But like I think both Batman, because I know you're a massive fan of Batman Begins as well. Batman Begins, and I feel like it's not necessary for Dark Knight Rises to be in the conversation because it's pretty well documented how that film failed in many ways. Some things probably being his fault, some maybe not. But I think that both Batman Begins and The Dark Knight are just truly fantastic films through and through. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But where do you think they fall, in the line of Christopher Nolan movies? Because I think it's easy to write off when someone does like dramas, thrillers, their own movies, like original concept movies, for them to step over into the superhero realm and be like, oh, it's a superhero movie.
Yeah. I think what has he made, like 11 movies, 10 or 11?
Something like that.
I'd say they probably fall in like the 5 or 6 range. Like right in the middle of his filmography. I think he still has to play with those movies as much as he got to do what he wanted to do. They still do play in the very firmly in a genre. And I think he was smart in making something like The Dark Knight less a comic book movie and more a crime thriller movie.
Yeah.
I think that was where a lot of his success was, because I don't think Christopher Nolan would have done very well if he went for a comic book movie.
Yeah.
I think
that's what makes that trilogy. It stands out and is almost kind of left in its time now, because comic book movies have turned into comic book movies. Like now, when anyone thinks about any superhero, you think just it's a Marvel movie, Marvel movie, or exactly what DC's trying to do. You don't really think back and go like, The Dark Knight is the template for superhero movies. But I love that. This is just like with Logan. It's like, I want to see these superhero movies taken in the direction where you're taking a different genre and putting the superhero into it, not just making superhero movies all the same.
Yeah, and with The Dark Knight, it was very much like, even Christopher Nolan admitted this, it's very much a like, what if the movie Heat, the Al Pacino Robert De Niro movie, was a Batman movie instead. And you can very, very clearly see those influences. Like the opening heist in Dark Knight is very clearly a riff on the heist in the middle of Heat. But he was very smart in picking what he wanted to draw on for those movies.
Yeah.
That being said, I don't feel like I think that they're great movies. I don't feel like that they transcend as well as something like Dunkirk does.
Yeah.
Or Memento does.
I think in the superhero realm, they transcend most.
I think absolutely. I think in terms of superhero movies, they're basically as good as they get.
Yeah.
While still having that studio oversight. I think he pretty much won out in terms of the studio battle. I think Dark Knight Rises didn't. I think that's sort of where the studio ended up winning out on that movie. But those first two, I think he really did the absolute best that you could do in taking on a huge Batman movie. That's where it's interesting to see the new Matt Reeves Batman movie, which is very scaled back and seems like he's
like they're taking a lot of inspiration from the spirit of Nolan.
Yeah, but I wonder if he's going to be able to make it more of a noir genre piece than even Christopher Nolan was able to do.
Yeah,
because it looks less and less like a blockbuster than any Batman prior.
Yeah.
So I think Nolan did a lot for letting directors have more control over studio movies. That being said, Rian Johnson destroyed that. Now studios are like, no, don't let them do their own thing again.
That too, yeah.
But yeah, I think they probably fall in the middle of his filmography, because the top Nolan movies are Dunkirk, Memento, Prestige, Inception, and then I'd say Batman Begins, Dark Knight, and then sort of the rest of them fall with Interstellar and Dark Knight Rises at the bottom for me.
Yeah, I can see that. And it's hard though, because in thinking about it, I really enjoy the high concept films in general. I would think I have trouble mixing things like the Dark Knight trilogy itself with his other films. But in my mind, I think Inception, I loved that. I really loved Tenet. I really loved Prestige. Those are probably my three truly wowed Nolan films. But then I also think of The Dark Knight itself as probably just about the best superhero movie that I've ever seen. It's in the top 3 of best superhero films for me. So those are kind of the ones that fall at the top for me. But then in hearing, your kind of lists, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. You know, like just from a competence level, I think that list makes sense. And then when I'm looking at it, though, even putting Interstellar and Dark Knight Rises at the bottom, you know, I'm like, that's not a bad bottom though. Like it's across the board. When I start thinking about how you would rank them, I feel like you are splitting hairs, even if it's like preference or, you know, you do have a strong opinion. Like the hairs between something like The Prestige and Dunkirk for me, like I don't see a massive difference. You know, I
think The Prestige is incredibly underrated in his filmography. I really don't hear it talked about a whole lot. But I definitely think it's one of his best movies.
Well, and I think that was the first Nolan movie I ever saw.
Really?
I would have seen, because Batman Begins came out first, right?
Yeah, they came out.
So I would have seen Batman Begins first, because I did see that when it came out. But I don't think because I was younger, a good deal younger, when that came out, I don't think I knew, like, this is this. I never made the correlation between this is the same. I just saw The Prestige and was like, you know, just renting a movie from Blockbuster at that point, I believe. It was just like, oh, it's a cool new movie that came out. I wasn't thinking, this is the guy that did Batman.
Right.
And I just remember really loving it on its own. Like I had no idea about things like directors and, you know, the economics of all that stuff at the time. But yeah.
A lot of people don't like the twist in that movie.
See, I love that movie.
I loved the end of that movie.
I've seen some love for it. You know, if you go on YouTube, you can find some really great.
There is now. I think it's definitely got a lot more now.
I think it's taken a lot of time for people to come around to examining that as a part of his legacy, as a major cornerstone of it.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, even though Memento was like a huge critical success, and I think a pretty good success in general, you got to think about like Prestige came out in like 2006. Dark Knight came out in 2008. Dark Knight was definitely his like blast off to just like total like critical adoration. I wonder if the
was
Prestige
a cultural like phenomenon.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if the Prestige would have done better if it came out after the Dark Knight.
Yeah.
Because you think about Dark Knight came out and then Inception was massive.
Yeah. I don't know if that would have been. I think it was good that it was Inception and Dark Knight together, though, because that Inception was just on just the main basis of the way that the film works. I think it was a good follow up. But if the Prestige got peppered in behind Dark, like after he cemented himself with Inception, if it got peppered in among Interstellar and Dunkirk and things like that, I could see that it being a very strong entry. More at the box office and to the reception, because I don't think it got bad reception by any means.
It was good. It was just compared to his other
understated.
Stuff, it was very underrated.
Yeah, but I think that pretty much wraps up our thoughts on the topic, though. So thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave us those sweet reviews on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever your podcast provider is, and we will talk to you guys in the next episode.